Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for How is Vaping Affecting Teens, especially during COVID. You're here with Operation Parent and Dr. Aaron Weiner this afternoon, and we're so glad you joined us. We're going to take a couple minutes and let everybody in to the webinar. So if you need to finish up your lunch or maybe take a look at the handouts, now's the perfect time to do that. We've got a large crowd with us this afternoon again, so we're excited about that, and it'll take us just a couple minutes to get everybody in. You've now joined us for How is Vaping Affecting Teens, especially during COVID, with Dr. Aaron Weiner and Operation Parent. As we open today, we'll take a couple minutes to tell you about our upcoming webinars. It's also a great time to go ahead and register for the next webinar, so you'll be set and ready to view those with us. So the next one are the effects of social distancing on teens' social and emotional development. That's happening Tuesday, October 27th at 2 p.m. with Caroline McGuire. We also are rebroadcasting Back to School, helping kids overcome school anxiety and build resiliency on Monday, September 28th at 8 p.m. We had a lot of interest and continued interest in the content with the times that we're in right now with COVID. So if you haven't seen that yet, please check it out on September 28th at 8 p.m. We're also rebroadcasting Keeping It Positive, Body Image and Self-Esteem on Monday, October 12th at 8 p.m. with Dr. Amy Grinnemeyer, who is a licensed psychologist. Here at Operation Parent, our mission is to love and support parents by providing real-world information, connection, and hope. I'm going to take just a couple minutes for anyone who might be new and let you know how the back end of our system is going to work today. If you could click on that orange arrow, you're going to open up the control panel. About halfway down the control panel, you will see a question section. You will send both questions and comments here anytime during the webinar. We love questions, so keep them coming. We are now getting a lot of questions at the end of the webinar, so we're going to do our very best to answer most of those live, if not all of them. If for any reason we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you following the presentation. All attendees will be muted during this presentation, but we will read your questions out to Dr. Weiner at the end. An email was sent to you today containing the handouts. You can also double-click here to download the handouts. Once the webinar has ended, you will not be able to download from this location. We put together 3 awesome handouts for you. One of them is Dr. Aaron Weiner's blog on vaping. It's titled Vaping 2020, the science and marketing tactics behind our vaping quagmire. We also have a handout from Julius B. Richmond Center titled E-Cigs and Vaping, What Parents Need to Know. And then we also have a great fact sheet from Tobacco 21 that you'll find very interesting to check out. But at this moment, it's my distinct pleasure to turn the webinar over to Dr. Weiner for his second webinar with us. We're so glad you joined us again. And thank you so much we're ready to learn with you this afternoon.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be back. And thank you everybody for attending. I really appreciate you sharing some of your time this afternoon. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist, currently in private practice and owning a consultancy group. And what I'm really passionate is about connecting folks to the information that they need to make the best and most informed decisions, whether or not that's parents with their kids, whether or not that's teachers, school administrators, physicians, behavioral health practitioners, whoever you are. There's so much information out there that I think if you're not directly plugged into it, as I at least try to be, it escapes you, and then it's harder to necessarily make the decisions in a really, really complicated space around addiction. And so last time I was here, I talked a bit about marijuana. Today, we'll be really drilling down on vaping and talking about what's going on here, how we got to this point, and then what we can do about it, both in terms of advocates, in terms of preventionists, but also just in terms of parents, either if that's us or if we're working with parents. So the objectives for today, hopefully by the time you leave, you have learned a bit about where this epidemic has come from, to talk about the vaping industry in terms of its footprint on what's going on here, steps, really concrete actionable steps that you can take, and then also a little bit on an overlap between vaping and COVID. So just briefly talking about what's going on in the country right now, the very quick answer is that signs are not good in terms of vaping. The past year use in the 2019 Monitoring the Future survey found a significant increase in both the vaping of nicotine and the vaping of marijuana from 2018 numbers. And just anecdotally, if you've talked to young people right now, particularly high schools, you'll see that this is the case. Today, the vaping, we're really going to focus primarily on nicotine, less so on the marijuana. A recent study just came out, actually. There were two kind of mildly dueling narratives. One data set found that 1 in 3 high school students now, from 2020 data, just released rather, 1 in 3 is vaping, which is really, really unfortunate, and even higher than what you're looking at here, 1 in 3 high schoolers. So that's a little bit higher than what we're seeing here, is vaping within the past month, and 50% within the past year. Then there was another one that found that number might be a little bit closer to 20. The bottom line is that it's not getting better, and I think that if you talk to young people, they'd very strongly agree with that. This is another way of visualizing the National Youth Tobacco Survey data. This is from their most recent report, and you can see that particularly since 2017, here's the high school e-cigarette use. You can see that it's just been exploding. And again, if it's gone up to 33%, as was found in one study, it's still ascending. So really bad news if you care about public health, really bad news if you care about the health of our kids. And really, I think is a call to action for us to do something about this. Now, where it came from, really that rise that we saw on the last slide here, the one that started in 2017, corresponds to Juul hitting the market. And Juul, until recent regulations have caused kids to switch a little bit, and more on that later, Juul really fueled the rise of youth vaping in a number of different ways. The first of which is that the way that it delivers nicotine to the brain is much faster and even stronger than other products. So you can see here, this is from their patent application, that the nicotine hits the brain harder at its peak than cigarettes, and a lot quicker than earlier e-cigarettes. And this was in their patent application, they said, because they wanted to try to pull people away from cigarettes, but they were absolutely informed. And this is all documented in this Reuters article that I pulled this graph from, that this would also hook kids a lot more quickly, because again, you're getting this extreme nicotine hit to the brain. But they continued along anyway. They also at one point were toying with the idea of putting kind of like a nicotine kill switch when you've hit a max amount. So like if you've taken enough of draws off the Juul in a day, then it would shut down. So they couldn't do any more, but they chose not to include that. A quick interesting follow-up on this as well. They recently found, a study came out that Juul actually delivers 5 times as much nicotine to the brain as a cigarette as quickly. I could send that study to you if you'd like. I should mention, I think my contact is somewhere on one of these slides, maybe the last one, but if you'd ever like any of the primary sources that I referenced today and you're not able to obtain them yourself, please just reach out to me and I'm happy to provide those to you. Now, flavors were another huge part of this, and these now you're not going to find anymore because of a partial flavor ban that we'll discuss in a minute. But kids love flavors. A study put out by the Surgeon General found that 85% of kids use because of flavors, per their own report. So when we talk about what brings kids in, you know, of all the Juul flavors, there were 2 that included tobacco, and everything else did not, including all these fruity flavors. Juul was not the only people who did this, but they were one of the first to really mainstream. Now, the next part of this has to do with marketing tactics, and this came from a New York Times article, these images, called "The Juul Lure Teenagers and Get Customers for Life." And this was the Juul launch campaign, essentially. And when you look at these pictures, and you look at the colors and you look at the models and you ask yourself, do these look like 55-year-old chain smokers? The answer is no, right? Of course they don't. They're much younger. They went into ninth grade classrooms, according to congressional testimony, and called their device totally safe. This was from teens in the room. And they spent over $200,000 on social media influencers. And the thing about social media, right, is that you don't go on there to get the 40 and up demo, right? That's not who you're angling after. A very concerning and interesting complaint was filed by the Massachusetts Attorney General back in February, really against Juul for getting the youth vaping epidemic started. And this is an excerpt from it. She highlights here, and there's a lot in there, very much worth looking up. You can just Google it, Mass AG Juul complaint. But this social media influencer was at most 18 years old when he was hired by Juul and posed with Juul. And the reason why this is important, right, is that when you look at Lucas Abad, and when you also go to the last slide, or this one, and you look at these models, and you ask yourself, who is this marketed at? It's young people, because they look at folks like Luca and they say, that's who I want to be. That's who I want to emulate. This is when we talk about trend setting, when we talk about what's cool, marketing has a lot to do with that. And the current marketing environment centers around social media and social media influencing. And so this was one tact actually that Juul intentionally took. Actually, in the Massachusetts AG's report, she documents how there's internal communications where they explicitly they took an original marketing campaign where they were showing like this is the old, and showing things like record players and Walkman and things like that, and then like this is the new, and then that's Juul to try to say this is outdated. But they intentionally scrapped that for more advertising like this, because the thought was that younger people would not know what those things were. That wouldn't speak to them in the same way, because they don't necessarily know what a Walkman is. They don't necessarily know what an Atari 2600 is, like the old video game consoles. And they wanted to be able to speak to that audience. And then you have explicit marketing like this, and this was taken right off of PodJuice's website. I grabbed it a couple weeks ago. When you look at this graphic and you ask yourself again, when you're trying to drop an image and you're making it a banana splashing out of ice, again, probably not adults. Now, the thing about advertising is that it works. And I won't read this whole abstract, but this is one article, this is another one, where basically what they found is that when you expose kids to vaping advertisements, it works, and they tend to vape more. Also very interesting, a study just came out a couple weeks ago that found that when kids are exposed to smoking, even right now, when they're exposed to smoking in media, they are more likely to vape. So they look at smoking and then they tend to vape more. Really interesting study looking at a few different TV shows, some in which there's a lot of smoking that goes on and some in which there's not. I should mention, quick plug for my social media, actually. I'm constantly pushing out journal articles and information on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter to a lesser extent, but on the things that I think are really interesting, these studies included. So please feel free to connect or follow me there if you'd like to keep up to date on this stuff. Now, in terms of why the advertising matters, it has to do with the principle of perceived risk and how that relates to use rate in terms of drugs. So this has been just a common pivot, an axiom, if you will, of the drug industry for ages, which is that the more risky someone thinks your substance is, the less likely that that person is going to use it. So if you're in the business of addiction, which is what vaping is, you want your product to seem as harmless as possible, or as least risky as possible, because then more people will use it. Now, there's a lot of studies that have looked at this, but this was the best graph I could find. This is a study that was looking at past month binge drinking here on the left and marijuana use here on the right, based on whether or not someone perceives a great risk, or a 12 to 17-year-old rather, perceives a great risk is the dark bar, and anything else, moderate, slight, or no risk, is on the right. And so if you look at binge drinking on the left there, you can see that it's over twice as likely that a young person would have binge drank over the past month if they did not perceive there to be a great risk. But on the right there, it's even more extreme for marijuana, maybe about 15 times more likely to use marijuana over the past month if they did not perceive there to be a great risk of doing so. So again, this is something where if you are in the business of addiction, you want it to seem as low of a bar to clear as possible for someone to do it. Now, why do kids use? There's a number of reasons, and it's different for everybody. But the main buckets that I find are that they're either doing it socially, which both cuts in terms of it cuts both ways in terms of either promoting your ability to be social if these are the networks that you're a part of, or not being ostracized for a network that you're already in. You might have gone through middle school with a group of friends, and now when they've gotten to high school, maybe some of them have started to vape, maybe some of them have started to use marijuana or drink. And now if you want to be able to still be with those friends and feel like you fit, you have to potentially do this, or you'll feel ostracized. Internal struggles, psychiatric issues in terms of depression, anxiety, trauma is a big one, are a reason not just why youth drink, but adults as well, or use substances. Sometimes it's related to school stress. That's a huge stress for kids, generally, and certainly now with COVID as well, with things either being virtual or going to school and worrying about infection. There's so much there. But the bottom line is that behavior is always purpose driven, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. So this is something that for us as adults, particularly if any of you are parents, that's really critical to remember, is that if you look at a child's behavior and it doesn't seem to make sense, that means there's something that you don't understand. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do or the healthy thing to do, but there is a purpose there. There's some benefit that's being derived from the behavior. We have to figure out what that is. And so when it comes to working with kids who are vaping or using other substances for that matter, one of the core foundational things that you need to learn is why. And we'll return back to that a little bit later in the presentation as well. Now, I got really excited back towards at the beginning of the year. There was talk that there might actually be a flavor ban, which I was very excited about, because this is something, in my opinion, that's been long overdue. We've banned flavored cigarettes since 2009 because we know that they disproportionately appeal to young people and they get people indoctrinated into nicotine. So this would have been fantastic. The problem is that after this was announced, the vaping industry really stepped up, spent millions and millions of dollars in lobbying to push back. And what happened was that it stalled and eventually got watered down. Now, just to shine a light on what happened here, I just want to talk about the different aspects here that they made. The first was an economic argument, and this has been one of the pivotal ones in terms of why the vaping market, which again has really sprung up just in the last few years, it's hard to get them to go away. And that's because they throw numbers out like, $24 billion industry, 166,000 jobs. And so the idea here is that there'd be a significant impact on the economy if we were to ban flavors. And this is another really common pivot between drug policy, between money and public health. We see this in cigarettes, we see this in vaping, we see this in marijuana. It's this question of how much do we want to give up in public health in exchange for money? And that's what's going on here. The extra kind of insult to injury of this argument actually is that although this much money might be coming in, we've known for ages that we lose far more money selling addictive products on the public health side. So in terms of the downstream health costs, the problems that those addictive substances cause, that actually costs far more than the amount of money you bring in tax revenue. For cigarettes, that's $15 we lose for every $1 we bring in taxes. For alcohol, it's 10. So this has been something that we've known for ages. So this is always a great argument on its face when you look at a big number, but then kind of multiply that by 10 to 15, and that's the amount that you potentially lose in a lot of other areas. Now, the other arguments that were made was the idea that this is a hammer versus scalpel issue, that just banning all flavors is a big mistake because the issue is more finely tuned. And that government overreach is involved, where do you really have the ability to say what we're selling or putting in our bodies? This was another one that I heard a lot that honestly puzzles me a bit. Harm reduction, that we're basically going to push people back to smoking, and that's going to be worse overall than where we are now. And why that one's odd to me is that Like, so one, although yes, there's no tar in vapes, and we've seen that in lab tests, there are a lot of other toxins and carcinogens that we'll talk about in a minute. And there's, in terms of the outcome, we've actually seen it be potentially just as bad for cardiovascular health as smoking. So how much harm reduction there actually is here is debatable. But regardless, if someone actually wants to quit smoking, it's not like they don't have any options, right? Even they could be using tobacco flavored vapes, or they could do menthol, which also exists in cigarettes, or they could be doing other things like cognitive behavioral therapy or nicotine replacement with patches or other FDA approved treatments like Chantix or Wellbutrin, or even hypnosis, honestly, has really good evidence for smoking cessation. So it's not like if an adult smoker doesn't have their blueberry ice vape, it's like, well, like no raspberry vapes for me, I'm going back to cigarettes. No, I think that's really a false argument. But harm reduction is a very trendy thing to talk about right now, and for good reason. There's some really good evidence behind certain things, but just because you say something's harm reduction doesn't necessarily make it so, nor does it mean that there aren't better options available. And lastly, and I also found this fascinating, it was the political cost. And I should mention, as I show this next slide, I'm not necessarily putting any one party under the bus. We just so happen to have a Republican president at this point, so that's where this is coming from. You switch things around, the vaping industry would have made a very similar argument if there was a Democrat in the presidency. But basically, they literally showed this data, and there was a campaign, hashtag I Vape, I Vote, talking about how basically don't mess with us because we're going to make you pay for it. And when you look at the battleground states in the election that's coming up, and you look at the 2016 win margin, you can see that the number of vapors is in many cases larger than the win margin in a lot of these states in either direction. And so again, from a political standpoint, this is a very compelling point. Now, the outcome of all of this was that there were massive loopholes in what was passed. And essentially what occurred was that the only things that got banned were pod-based flavors. You could still buy flavors in stores, and you could buy things called disposables. Now, one of the biggest companies selling these things was Puff Bar, and you can see here after the flavor ban, here's watermelon and blueberry ice and tangerine ice and leche ice and pineapple lemonade and strawberry, exactly the sort of thing that theoretically a flavor bar would stop. But these were ban would stop. But these were intentionally cut out of that legislation, again, in part to appease the industry. Now that said, the FDA just a couple months ago, actually in July, ordered Puff Bar off the market. Because they were, again, just flying in the face of this, and they were one of the biggest brands doing it. And now if you go to Puff Bar's website, this is all you see. Puff Bar has ceased all online sales in the US. So on the one hand, you'd think that would be a step forward, but these guys are still there. These are popular. I'm in the suburbs of Chicago. That's where I'm based out of. And these folks are still going strong with their tropical mango and their mighty mint. And these disposable devices, I should mention, they still have, so a Juul pod had about the same amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. So do these. They only cost a little bit more. So you see here, you get a 3-pack for 20. Juul pods were like, I think about $4.50 each, but you bought them in a 4-pack. So you're looking at the difference between $6.50 and $4.50. So it's not like they're prohibitively expensive. And you can just throw them away if you're about to get caught, where if you have a more expensive vape device, you can't do it. So these are, again, still being sold because disposables were still completely cut out. And then so are these. This is from Vape Wild's website, but you can still buy liquids. And there are a great many models of vape devices that have tanks where you refill them. They're not pod-based. And this is what you buy to put in there. And you can see they've got their grape vape and their zebra stripe gum, their rainbow crunch and their strawberry cotton candy and their birthday cake and their stoned age. So again, who are they marketing at with all of this? Pretty clear, but it's still out there. And so when we talk about loopholes and watering regulation down, it's because basically what the vaping ban did was assassinate Juul. I guess that's kind of what it did. It took, and they're still reeling from this at this point. They used to control 75% of the vaping market. They just recently, I think, cut another 50% of their workforce because they were really driving these flavors. That was such a huge part of their business. So it did that, but it's kind of like a hydra, where you cut off one head and 3 more spring up to take its place, unless you actually solve the problem in a comprehensive way, which we did not get. Now, I should mention, this isn't just at the federal level. Some states have moved to do this, and the vape lobby has done the exact same thing. Here's an example of it happening in March in Utah. There's more across the country as well. So this is an area, again, where there's a lot of benefit still potentially to be had at the state level if folks move things forward. Now, from a parent perspective, what should parents be concerned about regarding vaping? Let's talk a little bit about health. And what I'm going to reference here comes from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And I draw from them because it's really important that we are confident about where our information comes from, particularly in this day and age. And the vaping industry actually, much like the tobacco industry, has already started to produce their own research. There was a really interesting study out of Denmark, might have been like half a year ago now, but found that 95% of studies that found no negative consequence of vaping were funded by the industry, 95% of those. So it's really important that we are very mindful about where our data comes from. NAS actually, they aggregate lots of data. So they don't just look at a lot of studies, but they also look at it for quality, so that you're not looking at like a study with an N or a sample size of 20. It's the same thing as like a massive random samples, randomly controlled, randomized controlled, there's the word, randomized controlled trial, double blind, etc. So really good information. You can also, by the way, get this report for free online. NAS offers all their things for free. Okay, conclusion. So I'm just picking the ones here that I think are most relevant. There's conclusive evidence that in addition to nicotine, most e-cigarette products contain and emit numerous potentially toxic substances, including metals that can come from the metallic coil, the liquid, or how the device itself is used. There's also substantial evidence that some of the chemicals in there are capable of causing DNA damage and mutagenesis. And DNA damage and mutagenesis is what causes cancer. So although we don't have a lot of data yet that it shows clearly that vaping causes cancer, we basically just need to get it more time, give it more time, because vaping causes the thing that causes cancer. So pretty safe bet there. Now, part of the reason why we know this is likely the case is that we've identified a lot of these toxins, including Berkeley Lab, which came up with 31 different toxic chemicals, some of which are here. The Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education that found a lot of different carcinogens, including some of our favorite heavy metals like lead and nickel and cadmium, and then also others here. Now, I think it's worth mentioning as well that some of these products, kids might be like, well, how are those in there? I didn't know. I didn't know that formaldehyde was in there, for example. Where did that come from? Well, part of the issue with vaping and vapes is, one, it's very heterogeneous what's inside vape liquid because there's no standards. Actually, sometime this month, sometime in September, is when finally the FDA, after fighting through lawsuits from the Vaping Trade Association, where finally the FDA is going to get samples of everything being sold to approve it for safety. They actually have not been able to do that yet. So everything is produced essentially overseas in China, and we have no idea what's really inside. That's one element. Now, the other, though, is that when you superheat vape liquid, the chemicals inside of it change. So formaldehyde, for example, where formaldehyde comes from is vape liquid, generally speaking, is made up of 2 different components mixed at some, whatever ratio you want. One is called propylene glycol, and the other is called vegetable glycerin. And when you superheat propylene glycol, it degrades into formaldehyde, amongst other things. So no, formaldehyde is not one of the original ingredients, but when you superheat propylene glycol, it turns into that. So that'll be in pretty much every puff. Another a product of degradation here is diacetyl. This causes popcorn lung, the potentially fatal and irreversible lung disease. Diacetyl comes from the breakdown of flavors. It was actually first diagnosed in workers in microwavable popcorn plants when they were standing over these massive vats of artificial butter flavor that they were churning, and they breathed it in. And lo and behold, here it is in vapes as well. So we really don't know what is in there or what even is in there degrades down into. So it's really critical that we're careful. Additionally, there is substantial evidence that yes, they are addictive, which makes sense given that there's nicotine in there. Now, very briefly, we're going to talk on the vaping epidemic. This actually, we had the first death due to vaping in the world right here where I'm located in Illinois. Not a good thing. Well, what happened here essentially was eventually dubbed E-Valley. I'm forgetting exactly what the acronym stands for, but something vaping and lung-related illness. But basically, people were having a really intense lung-related illness problem. Many people of whom recovered, but some of which died. Now, a lot of it centered actually around THC products rather than nicotine, although not all of them. It ended up being somewhere in the 80 to 90% range came from THC products. And the primary chemical culprit, it was not determined to be the only one, but one of the primary culprits was something called vitamin E acetate. Now, what that is it's a vitamin, which is fine if you eat it or you rub it on your skin, but like most things in this world, it might be okay to do that, but it's not okay to breathe it into your lungs. And so what happens when you do that is it creates oil-based lung damage, which was leading to a lot of these problems. Now, where it came from, largely speaking, is it has to do with how these products are made. So if you're trying to, say, create a vape cartridge with THC, but you want to save on costs, maybe you water it down a bit, kind of like people used to do it with alcohol sometimes. As you water it down, you hope people don't notice the difference. The thing about vaping cartridges, though, THC ones, is they've got a little bubble in them, and you can actually tell if the liquid seems too thin. You do what's called a bubble test, where you take it, you turn it upside down, you see how quickly the bubble rises to the top. And so what people would do is they would first cut the THC with something to boost the volume, but then they'd have to make it more viscous, right? They got to make it thicker so that bubble doesn't rise. That's why they put the vitamin E in there, and that makes it seem more viscous. So it's all about cutting the product. And that's what led to the vitamin E being in there. Now, it's worth mentioning as well that there was a lot of people crying, well, this is why we should just be commercializing and legalizing marijuana everywhere. But actually, so it's not just black market, but actually 1 in 6 cases of this came from commercially purchased THC, according to the CDC. So that's not a silver bullet. There's people selling cut cartridges and low quality products in states that have commercial markets as well. And we could talk a lot more about, today's not a THC talk, not a marijuana talk, so we won't go into that. I'll just leave you with, in terms of like, how does this happen? There was a report that came out of Oregon about a year ago that found that they'd actually only inspected, per regulations, they'd only inspected 33% of grow facilities and 3% of storefronts. 33 and 3. So that's how this happens, right? Because people aren't actually walking. And when you're designing a system based on trying to bring in as much revenue as possible rather than actually, public health, that's when you start to see those things happen. But that is a story for another day. In terms of the epidemic as well with Valley, it was just really nasty. It predominantly impacted young people because, again, young people are the ones who are vaping. And you saw scenes like this, where you had this is an 18-year-old from Gurnee and a 26-year-old from Wisconsin. Again, I'm local to Illinois. That's why I pulled these out of the news, but I'm sure it touched everyone's community who's on this call to some extent. Now, concerns for adolescents in particular, basically, you do not want to take in nicotine from these products in any way other than with a vape device as intended, because it is really, really highly concentrated. If you drink it, if you get it on your skin, if you inject it, it can cause a lot of problems, including death. So very careful with these things around, particularly if there are young kids who could get into those vials. That's a particular issue. There's also substantial evidence that if you vape, you are more likely to start using combustible cigarettes. And then when you do use, that you use more than you otherwise would have. Which again makes sense, that if someone's already addicted to nicotine, they're going to be kind of further along that tolerance chain. But this is part of why we've seen a lot of cross-pollination between big tobacco, the vaping industry, marijuana. They all actually feed into each other with trends. Like you get someone a foot in one area, they're much more likely to do all three. And so actually Juul is owned, the majority stake is owned by Altria, which is the owner of Marlboro. And so they're quite literally controlled by big tobacco right now. And so we see a lot of this all over the industry, a lot of people who are either bad actors or have been bad actors. Now, in terms of COVID, there's been a couple of reports that made pretty big news that I'm going to highlight here. You know, obviously COVID is new, therefore we don't have as much data on it as we might like. The publication process also takes time, but this one just recently came out, a report that found that teens who vape are 5 times more likely to contract COVID than those that do not. And actually those that both vape and smoke are 7 times more likely to do this. Now, part of this might be because I've heard just anecdotally from multiple pediatricians that kids are absolutely still vaping, still congregating. You obviously can't vape with a mask on. She's heard plenty. One in particular that I spoke to has heard reports of people sharing vapes as well. You know, they're basically not concerned about it, but it's raising their risk 5-fold at least. And part of the issue here as well, another study that just recently came out, kind of technical, we're not going to go through all of this right now, but basically vaping and smoking both actually prime the lungs to be more severely impacted by COVID. So you are more likely to end up in an ICU. You're more likely to end up with serious complications due to COVID if you are vaping or smoking. So if ever there was a reason to message out, I mean, I feel like we keep getting these warning signs that, you know, we hopefully are making their way down to adolescents. I know that when I do school assemblies, you know, back when that was a thing, I brought up the Valley. When this starts up again, certainly I would talk about this as well. But it's a very, if you care about your health as a young person, this hopefully would be a very compelling reason to not vape. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we can do, because I'm a big fan of information. Information is very useful, but at the end of the day, if you can't use it in any way, then it doesn't necessarily help you. So let's talk a little bit about how we might be able to move certain things, to move our projects, our initiatives forward. So I call coalitions here because they've actually been very successful in the past at improving these sorts of statistics. And I'm just highlighting tobacco here. So you could see that in 99, this was the youth, the grades 9 to 12 rate of smoking. And you can see it's just gone down year after year after year after year. And so a tip of the cap to folks on the call who are part of coalitions, drug-free communities, and similar. You guys have done an amazing job with this, but and there's a lot of different angles to go at to achieve this. But I think that we have a lot to learn from what happened here, because this is what a successful drug mitigation campaign looks like. And right now, what we're looking at, unfortunately, is with youth vaping, and honestly, also with marijuana, is kind of like, you know, flashback to the 40s, 50s, and 60s with tobacco, right? Where we're seeing companies and industries at the height of their power and around misinformation and all of this. And with tobacco, it took us a long time. We really didn't start to see this start occurring until the late 90s. And even now, smoking still kills 350,000 people a year in the United States. It's complications related to smoking. It's really unfortunate. So the question is, for these industries, and again, today we're focusing primarily on vaping, how can we replicate this sort of success, and how can we replicate it sooner? What can we learn from the past? Because somewhere along the way, smoking went from something that was cool to something that was disgusting. And we need to figure out, how do we do that with vaping? How can we replicate this success? So from the CDC, the best practices that they recommended for smoking were state and community level interventions involving mass reach health communication and cessation interventions, surveillance and evaluation, so making sure that we're keeping an eye on how these initiatives are going, and then infrastructure and administration management. So this isn't just something that we're kind of waving our hand at. This is something where we've actually got people evaluating it, overseeing it, making sure that this is something that's just as planful and just as intentional as, for example, say the vaping industry is, when they've got millions of dollars with lobbyists who might have even done message testing, and they've got everything that they need to go in to try to get what they want, and they're working on this, you know, this is their job. They're doing this 40, 60 hours a week. This is something where to push back against that, we have to fight fire with fire. essentially. We can't be just doing it part-time. It's not necessarily going to work. Now, I know for me, this is also something that I really have to think about a lot when it comes to prevention work or policy work, which is what is my circle of influence versus my circle of concern. I'm borrowing this from Stephen Covey, but essentially our circle of concern is much larger than our circle of influence, pretty much always. I mean, goodness, I would love to do something at the federal level, but I can't. I'm a psychologist outside of Chicago with no national platform in politics. So I have to scope myself down a bit. And the best thing to do then is to really think about your circle of influence and invest yourself there. And for many of us, that is our communities. That maybe for some of us, our state, but there's a lot of good that can be done if you scope things down and you focus very, very locally. And in particular, what we should be thinking about are these health communication interventions and cessation interventions in the absence of funding to potentially do these last two. We can at least start with what's in reach. So in terms of how to communicate, the first thing to do is take a look at what's going on around you. So is there another coalition, for example, that's already doing this work where you could work with or piggyback? Is there something going on statewide where there's been a vaping initiative? And in terms of your work in the media, who defines the narrative? And this one honestly is critical because, and we'll talk about local media in a second, but the narrative around an issue is so important. I guess to flash over to marijuana again for a second, I was just talking to someone from Pennsylvania the other day who said that their governor recently said that marijuana wasn't addictive, which is of course completely untrue. Marijuana is physically addictive. It's the second most common substance that we treat in rehab programs. But you say that, right? And you have people with platforms say things like that, and then all of a sudden it's what manufacturing a controversy looks like when there actually isn't. So the narrative and who's out there, who's speaking matters tremendously. And so these ideas of, again, that we're pushing people back to smoking, you can find a lot of editorials on this about the idea you take away blueberry vapes and then people are going to go back to smoking, and that we need to hold on about that. Okay, like they're getting into Forbes, they're getting on wherever it is that they're publishing this, and that's great. But then there also has to be another narrative. There has to be one talking about, well, maybe we should be looking, if there's better options, maybe we should be doing those better options, right? Maybe we don't have to settle for something in the middle of, there's low-hanging fruit elsewhere. So getting out there and setting an edge that's more advantageous for public health and less advantageous for the industry, which again has a lot of money to do this, really important. We have to raise our voices to make up for our lack of funding. Local media is a great way to do that. So a lot of times if you have local stations, particularly if you're in smaller markets, or if you have just again very local like city-based news stations, it's just a way to get out there. Another really important one is social media. So a great part about social media, a great part about YouTube, for example, is that your information lives on in perpetuity, right? It doesn't get old. It's right up there. People can search for it online and potentially find it after it's up. So it's not just like a flash in the pan. It persists. And so getting out there, getting on social media, really important. Additionally, because a lot of these young people who we're trying to reach consume the vast majority of their lives through their phones and electronic devices. It's just hardwired into who they are these days. And so if we're not speaking to them through those channels and other people are, then we are missing a tremendous opportunity to do good. On the political side, local reps want local experts. So if there is some work, for example, if you're interested in doing this work around a flavor ban in your state, make sure you reach out to the sponsors of that bill. Make sure you reach out and say, how can I support you? How can I speak at your press conferences? How can we get some buzz around this? They would much rather have experts from their community, from their state, than outsource somebody. If they're able to do that, it lends a lot more credibility to their constituents and to the message locally, honestly. So in terms of angles to take when you're communicating this, I would very strongly recommend leading with emotions and then following with facts. So what I mean by this is that if you go up to a high schooler who's not necessarily receptive to your message, and you just kind of like list off all the carcinogens and all these negative implications, they're probably not going to listen to you. They'll tell you like that you're not woke, or that you don't know what you're talking about, or that they read something else somewhere, and then you're gone. And so what I'd recommend, what I found works well for me, is I lead with emotions, essentially by starting and pushing really hard into the idea of there are rich people manipulating you for money because they think that you're young and stupid, essentially. And let me tell you, there is nothing that gets a high schooler more irritated than the thought that an adult is taking advantage of them for money because they're young. They don't want to be seen as young. They want to be treated with respect. And the best part about this argument is that you're not lying. It's 100% true. My slide deck for assemblies and for presentations when I work with kids spends a lot more time talking about marketing and how marketing works, and talking about current vaping marketing. And it's really showing them that they are actually in the crosshairs. And the thing about that is that then once you get their attention that way, that, oh, wait a second, like maybe he's got a point there, maybe they've got a point, maybe I am being targeted. Then when you say, and here's why I'm telling you this, because you deserve to know, here's what's going on in your lungs, here's the implications of what's happening, then all of a sudden they're listening to that. Because not only are they being fooled, but they understand that this would never be happening if not for the marketing, and if it was just being done on its health merits alone. Because again, there's carcinogens, there's toxins. Focus on perceived risk. So remember that graph back from the beginning of the presentation. If you can move that pivot, you can help reduce use. Again, right now it's a very steep uphill battle. Even the word vape, right? It sounds like water vapor, right? That's what, technically speaking, it's an aerosol. It's not vapor, it's an aerosol, but vapor sounds harmless. Vapor sounds like water, whereas aerosol sounds like you're putting your mouth over a spray paint can or something. So they're not using those words, but you'll hear that come out of kids' mouths, right? That it's it's just flavoring and water, or it's not even a big deal. It's just a little bit of nicotine. Everybody's doing it. Stuff like that. And again, you'll hear the same thing with marijuana. Things like it's just a plant, it's legal anyway, so why does it matter? Isn't it medicine? Things like all of that does is it lowers the perceived risk. And that's part of why the industries push out these tropes, because then you hear them coming out of kids' mouth to rationalize their behavior. So if you're able to act on that and leverage perceived risk, that's a very powerful tool as well. You don't necessarily need to use scare tactics, because that's not necessarily convincing. That doesn't necessarily persuade people, but even just healthy amounts of information, treating kids with respect, I found works really well. Now, remember as well, this is a culture war, not an information war. So this is something, again, where this is about beliefs, not about facts. And this is something, unfortunately, that we're seeing more and more in our society today. But this is, again, really about culture. Are they even going to listen to you? So when you're talking about can you get through to kids, ask yourself, who are relevant influencers in your area? Are any with you? Are they working with you? Are you speaking their language? A tool that I'll bring up in just a couple minutes on the parent side of things is through an organization called the Truth Initiative, and they do a great job of this. If you're not familiar with their website, with their content, check it out. They've done a lot of work around vaping, but they create content and they create messages that are clearly meant to appeal to a younger audience, and it shows. It just very clearly shows. They do an excellent job with that. So think about that as well when you're designing your message. In terms of effective health messaging through the CDC, here are their tips. Scope down to your core audience. This one's really important. You cannot speak to everybody at the same time. You can't, even if you want to. So really think about, who am I speaking to, and then design that intervention for them. State the issue clearly, include credible supporting facts, evoke a shared value. This is something, again, that pretty much everyone would agree with. Like, we all deserve to have clean air in our high school bathrooms, or something like that. Or you should decide what you put in your lungs, not corporate America, or not addiction for profit. Something that clearly is appealing to a broad range of people. And then make sure to include a call to action when you're doing health messaging. What can people do? And actually, if you look at this presentation today, this is pretty much exactly what I'm trying to do here today, in that order. And right now we're in the call to action part. But that's what you do. You want to inform people, get them moving, and then point them in a direction, because that'll help them get somewhere. So to sum up this part about coalition encouragement, there was a multifaceted effort that's persistent, that brought us to where we are, and it's going to take the same thing to get us out. As I said before, we have to fight fire with fire. We have the same tools, and we have to be savvy enough to use them. Otherwise, we're putting ourselves at a structural disadvantage. So make sure to lean on your parents, use your voice, and think local. Now, in terms of the parents, let's talk a little bit about this too before we're out of time today. I want to talk about reducing risk, increasing protective factors, knowing some signs, and then also staying connected. So this is a graph from NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, about how addiction forms. And just very briefly, for sake of time here, you're looking at a combination between biology and the environment, combined with drug availability, that then leads to the brain reacting to that drug, eventually forming addiction. Now, we can't necessarily change what's on the left, right? The biology is what the biology is, but the environment we can. And specifically, what we're going to talk about right now are parents' use and attitudes, peer influences, and community attitudes. Now, again, for sake of time, we're not going to read this whole chart. I think you already have the slides as available for a download, so feel free to dive in later. But basically, there are ways to structure both the family and outside the family ecosystem, social ecosystem, to either provide risk factors or protective factors against the development of an addiction. And just a very broad strokes view of this is that the risk factors of the family are having a kind of a chaotic home environment, people around them using permissive in terms of youth use potentially as well, lack of mutual attachment or nurturing, versus the opposite of that, a strong bond, setting clear limits and expectations for behavior, etc. And then outside the family is honestly about the same sort of thing, where you're talking about who are they hanging out with, what are the influences that they're under, how are they doing academically, that's a big one. A protective factor, this one's really important, is age-appropriate monitoring of behavior, including social media, I would add, and having strong bonds with pro-social institutions. So really trying to provide an environment that gives kids the best chance possible. There's no fail-safes, right? There's no fail-safes, but there are things we can do to try to skew the odds in our favor. Now, in terms of the signs of use, there's a number of them to look for, just that may have something to do with a substance use issue. They can include decline in hygiene, burns on the fingers or lips, dilated or red eyes. Dilated, of course, for opioids, red a little bit more for marijuana. Long sleeves in warm weather can be actually hiding track marks if someone's injecting. Wardrobe changes, money irregularities, either too little or too much. So if kids are either buying the products or if they're selling it. There's a lot of kind of like low-level drug dealers in schools that serve as middlemen who provide the products to their peers. So watching for that. Secretive phone calls, changing in sleep habits or energy, often asking to go to the bathroom, having the munchies or sudden appetite, that's for THC as well. And any unusual smells or overuse of scents, gum, mouthwash, and trying to mask something that they're doing. Other aspects that you might see when someone's having an addiction problem include issues with school functioning, their peer group, where you might notice that old friends fade away. They've got new friends, but you've never met them. On social media, what are they following and posting? And then on the family side, you might have started to notice that they're breaking curfew, they're moody, have some strained relationships, that sort of thing. So really, the bottom line of these are that you need to stay connected to your teen. For parents, if you don't know what normal looks like, then you won't know when normal changes. And so what you've got is this environment where there's a lot of vaping going on, there's a lot of pressures on kids, and so we need to be aware of when something changes. So if your teen needs help, here are some it's obviously personalized, but very quick hit ideas here. So the first is understand why, and I mentioned this earlier on. This is critical because if you don't know why the behavior is happening, you can't just necessarily punish it out of them, right? Because they're gonna get out of your house at some point anyway, right? And they've got to make their own choices. So if you don't meet that need in another way, it's very difficult to stop them from going back. And speaking to that point as well, look to reinforce the positive, not simply punish. What we know is that reinforcing wanted behaviors is just as, if not more important than punishing negative ones. It's kind of this idea where if you push, that means that they can push back, right? They can resist if you're pushing them that way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't discipline, and of course you should. It's not that there's not a place for punishments, but a lot of times if we're struggling with a child, we're not celebrating even the little victories, like cleaning up your room, coming back by curfew, getting your homework done. It's kind of like that's the expectation, and the only rise they're going to get out of you is if they go under that. Make sure to celebrate and reinforce the behaviors you want to see repeated. It's critical. Consider at-home drug testing. So if you've had this issue with a child, you know there's issues going on with drugs, vaping included, you can test at home. They're very inexpensive. If you're looking for nicotine vaping, you're going to look for nicotine and then cotinine. Cotinine is the metabolite of nicotine. Tests, and you can test them. Now, nicotine and cotinine does get out of your urine relatively quickly, usually within about 3 days. So you'd want to pick your frequency accordingly if you wanted blanket coverage versus just random. But part of the reason why this is useful is not just necessarily to try to hold a child accountable or to learn if they're lying to you, if they have a propensity for that, but also to give them what's called a refusal strategy. So again, when you're in this really complicated social milieu where there's a lot of vaping going on, you've got to find a way to navigate that without necessarily making yourself into a social pariah, which again, isn't always the case, but for some kids it might be. For them to be able to say, my parents are crazy, they drug test me all the time, I can't do it, that actually also helps give them an out. So just something to consider as well, an arrow to have in your quiver, if you will. I mentioned the Truth Initiative before. Check out This Is Quitting. Head over to their website. This Is Quitting is a text-based intervention tool for vaping cessation for kids. And it is actually really neat. And the only time in my life that I lied and said that I was a 16-year-old boy, I signed up for this just to see what it was. And it's a great program. They actually adjust the slang based on the age that you put in. So basically, they try to speak your language. They help you set a quit date. And then they provide both daily and then on-demand support in the form of like quotes, or if you're having a craving, you can text that in and you'll get a supportive idea or phrase or tool that they could use. Really cool program, and honestly, one of the only interventions that I'm aware of right now that's available on vaping, period. There's actually been very little done on this right now for some odd reason, because vaping is very prevalent. But definitely check that out if you've got a kid who's particularly if they're wanting to stop. Parent coaching is another thing that you can do. This is something that I do personally, is that I coach parents who are looking to figure out how do I work better with my child. That's something that if you're really feeling like you don't know where to go with it, that you can look into. And then certainly as well, therapy. And again, I'm biased. I am a licensed psychologist, so I'm a big fan of therapy. But if there's something going on in the child's life that's making it so that they are vaping, and if something internal or some underlying problem that they're having to deal with, a good therapist can go a very long way, and this is absolutely well worth the investment. So to sum things up, and then I'll be happy to take questions in the time that we have left. Vaping is harmful to the health of adolescents, and it magnifies COVID-19 risks. So this is something where it is not benign, it is not harmless, it is something that we really do need to be concerned about, and honestly, kids do too. And the hope is that if you've got a kid who's on the bubble of not knowing if they want to vape or not, and I say that because there's a group of kids who were never going to do it anyway for a number of health-related reasons, and there's another group of kids who probably aren't going to listen to you anyway. But if you've got some of them who are in the middle, where they're not sure what to do, or they're mainly just feeling a lot of social pressure, we can get through to them. And I think it's, as long as we message it properly, I think that we really can. Now, vaping is a business, and up until this point, they're winning. And I guess that's the bad news. They're winning hearts, minds, and health. They have the messaging down. They know what to do with influencers. They are well funded, and they know what they're up to. And so we really have to be a lot more pointed and, in my opinion, aggressive about how we go after this with our policies, with our interventions, or we're going to be stuck here for a very long time. Because if they're going to make $10 million off of investing $1 million in lobbying, they're going to invest $1 million in lobbying every single time. It's just the economics of it. And so what we have again is our voices. We have our ability to, whatever that platform, whatever that circle is, that's yours. Use that. That's what we have. Honestly, that's why I'm talking to you guys today. A focused effort has worked before, and it can work again. Look at smoking, right? This is possible, and every voice counts. So again, for the parents on the call, stay connected as much as you can. Make yourself someone safe to talk to. Make yourself a confidant, because if they don't talk to you about it, if they're not connected with you, it's going to be so much harder to intervene and so much harder to help. So in terms of resources, just some things to look at: Tobacco 21, AAP.org, Truth Initiative, we mentioned already, Partnership to End Addiction. There's also a really good Stanford toolkit that I could send out the link for as well, for prevention on vaping as well. So thank you everyone again for your time and your attention today. Hopefully you heard something that was useful. If you'd like to follow me on social media, I try to put this information out as I hear it. I'm usually putting new things out 4 or 5 times a week, I'd say. I also do a video blog on YouTube. You can subscribe to that as well if you'd like, where I break down concepts around addiction and psychology into about 3 to 4 minute chunks. I call it TLDR addiction and TLDR psychology. So thank you again so much. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the organizers, and I'm also happy to take some questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wonders. Phenomenal. Let me get my screen all set up, and that way I can take over here. There it goes. And all right, I just wanted to go over real quick the webinars that are going to be coming up. I know we did this at the very beginning, but just for the sake of everybody, there's the next webinar that we will have will be the effects of social distancing on teens' social emotional development. These are all open for registration right now, so go ahead and register. We have a couple rebroadcasts coming up. On next Monday is the rebroadcast of Back to School, helping kids overcome school anxiety and build resiliency. And then Keeping It Positive, Body Image and Self-Esteem, that's in October. Something else, I know we're getting questions. We record all of our webinars. So the recordings will be sent out tomorrow. So tomorrow, to anyone who has registered, whether you've attended live or not, you will get a recording link in the follow-up email. That will go out around 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. In the email for those who attend the live event, you will also have a certificate of attendance. That'll be attached. So if you're attending the live event, you will have in your follow-up email the recording link, a survey link, which will also, the survey will show up immediately when I shut down the broadcast at the end, and you will have a certificate of attendance. For those of you that are listening to this recording, you will get the recording in your follow-up email as well as the survey. Something else to keep in mind is another informational webinar that is free. It's on e-cigarettes 101. This is the link, and you can register for that. You would go to that registration link or go to the Richmond Center and send them an email, but that is available from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Also, a couple questions about our parent handbooks. There is an available discount of 20% off the purchase of one parent handbook. We have elementary, and we also have middle and high school. You can go to our website at operationparent.org and then click on shop, and that is where you will find our handbooks. If you want to take advantage of the purchase discount, please put in the discount code that is listed. We also are available on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, so please follow us. And with that, we're going to go back to questions. I'm sorry, here, got a little bit ahead of me. So hold on for just a minute. I keep losing you, and I don't want to do that, but at the same time, I'm trying to get my webcam back to come back in, and it is just fighting me here. Hold on for just a minute. There we go. Okay, now I see it. All right, so let's get into the questions, and let me just do this. All right. I know we were getting some as we were going over your material. They were coming in, and a couple of them were clarifications on some things, Dr. Weiner.
Mhm.
All right. So here we go.
I'm ready. If you see me glancing off to the side, there's a freakishly large wasp that just keeps coming to my window.
Oh,
It probably won't get in. I don't think it eats glass, but it's still just mildly concerning.
if it was in my house, you wouldn't see me on the webcam. That's the one aspect I really don't like or watch.
You know those forked tails, you know. Anyway, all right, let's do questions. All right.
All right. Have you recently seen the data that vaping by youth has shown some reductions? So it's more of a statement.
I actually did. So I wrote a blog post about this. So if you head over to my website at weinerphd.com, head over to the blog. I actually wrote a post about how on the CDC's website, 1 month apart, they published one study that said 33% of kids vaping, and then another that it's actually potentially gone down a little bit. And I break down a little bit the statistics of that, as well as why we're seeing those going back and forth. I alluded to that a little bit earlier in the actually it was the very beginning of the talk, but basically they were taken with two different sampling methodologies and two different samples, which doesn't mean that anyone is more or less right. My takeaway from it is that we can't necessarily assume that it's going in any direction. You know, if anything, we have to assume the status quo. I certainly have not heard anecdotally from kids that it's getting any better. So
Okay.
I would at least wouldn't assume that, but check out my blog. I explain the statistics behind that a little bit more. But yes, I did see that.
All right. Thank you. Let's see here. Do you think that kids view vaping as a more healthier way to smoke? Or is it just a cool thing?
I don't necessarily, so my experience with kids has not been that they're like, well, I really want to be smoking, but I can't, so instead I'll do this other thing. I think it's more of just, it's a social phenomenon. I think it tastes good to them. I think that there's, again, a lot of this rationalization, permission structure work going on here where kids just think it's okay to do for a number of the reasons that we listed. So I do think that they think that it's safer. I do think that they think that it's less harmful. And to be honest with you, that's not entirely untrue. There are aspects about it, right? No tar that make it potentially not as bad as smoking. However, if you're not doing anything, it's a lot worse than that, right? Because there are toxins and there are carcinogens, and I think that's the critical element.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. A recent AP article indicated that, indicated, this is in September, adolescent vaping has dropped from 5 million to 1.8. Pandemic has impacted use, and kids are concerned about their health, as well as new laws banning under 21. So that's just a comment. And then there's somebody else that's saying that in New Jersey, they have made it illegal to sell disposable e-cigarettes, including flavors, to those under 21. Is the 21, I know, so this is a state by state law, correct? It's not a national, this is state by state. They have to come in and decide to make it under 21, or how's that work?
I'm pretty sure we made tobacco 21 national. I think that happened in the last.
Yeah. All right, so that's good. Even though the composition of every vape is different, but there is always propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin no matter what. Is that true?
I think for the most part, I will say that I'm not an actual vaping, I do not vape, I'm not a vaping consumption aficionado. I will say, however, that the vast majority of liquids I've seen involve one or both of those. That includes pod-based systems like Juuls, that includes the liquids that you buy and refill, particularly the propylene glycol element of it. So I wouldn't rule out that there's something else, but I'd say the vast majority are gonna have that in there.
Okay. Was the death linked to vaping from the nicotine vape or from THC vape?
So the deaths were, again, 80 to 90% related to THC. So 10 to 20% were people who denied ever using THC products as part of this. It's worth mentioning as well that there were some deaths that came only from people who said that they'd used nicotine. And there was one report put out by Mayo Clinic that said that what they were seeing in the lungs was more akin, they called it looked like chemical burns like mustard gas, which would not be what you'd find from vitamin E. So although it was pretty clear by the end that vitamin E was responsible for a lot of it, it wasn't all. And the same thing with the THC. THC was responsible for most of it, but not all.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Uh, is there any evidence removing flavors is increasing traditional cigarette use?
I have seen none that it does that. If that is there, I would honestly like to see it. I should mention I'm not one of those so dogmatic people that if there's not some good evidence that proves a point opposite to what I'm believing, that I won't take that evidence and adjust my views. So if there is some good evidence out there that's again not industry sponsored, I would definitely love to hear about that.
Okay. I do know when they took Juul and banned the Juul flavoring, I know the puff bars went through the roof, at least in this area. We saw it like everywhere.
Yeah.
With just a question, I do know Juul still does their traditional flavor and the menthol flavor. And so I know you mentioned that their sales have gone down because they lost their flavors from being able to be sold, but do you see kids shifting to the traditional flavors because they're still enjoying vaping?
So this is just anecdotally for me. The quick answer to that would be no. They switched to the disposables. They want the flavors. They don't really. The device is kind of incidental. And Juul pioneered something where the form factor was very visual appealing, looked like a flash drive, and also, and this was key, it was small enough that it would fit in your fist, right? So kids could take the draw off of it, blow it off into like like in a sweater in the winter or something, and be rebellious that way and do it during hi Wasp. Do that during class. So that's where that came from. Puff bars had the same. They were colorful, but they had the same sort of form factor. Stigs also are very tiny. So no, I haven't found them switching to tobacco. I found them switching to other flavors.
To other flavors.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they still have the disposables, don't they? Not disposables. The pods themselves that you can buy, like little things, just a flavoring, so that you can refill your own.
Oh yeah, like the vials from that website.
Yeah.
So you generally wouldn't use those with Juuls though. You'd use those with pens that are made for that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me see here. Let's see.
These are a lot of really good questions. Thanks for your engagement.
Yeah, there's quite a few here. I'm just trying to go through some of them that we've answered that are kind of relevant to each other, so I don't want to go there.
I should mention as we're looking through, if we don't get to your question or if you've got another one, please email me or reach out to me on social media. I will be happy to answer the question. If it hasn't come through, I'm really passionate about having people be able to work in this area. If you're interested, and whatever I can provide to help, I'm there.
Somebody's asking, are they able to use the slides from your PowerPoint? Is that something that you're okay if they're asking, or would it just be the release of some slides?
Yeah, so if you need actual PowerPoint slides, certainly you can you reach out to me directly. It is on Operation Parent, so actually I guess we should probably get their permission as well. Generally speaking, I just credit me and we're good.
Okay, all right. Knee correction. You had said that, oh, I see, that dilation of the pupils is associated with marijuana and opioids. And opioids is extreme constriction of pupils. THC, oh boy, and benzodiazepines and some others cause the dilation. Please clarify.
Oh, yeah. So certainly there's other substances that can do it. Nicotine actually doesn't really cause dilation. I was referring more to opioids with that. The redness in the eyes is what comes from the THC and is kind of specific to that.
Okay, all right. And opioids does cause extreme constriction. So
constriction, yes.
Right. Okay. Says, as far as I know, texting quit programs are for kids 13 and older. I have a hard time finding help for kids under 13 who are vaping. Do you have any suggestions there?
That is really tough. I guess the
Yeah,
quick
I
answer
think
is
so.
that is no, not anything on like a standardized basis. When I said this is quitting is like one of the only things I found, it really is. My best recommendation there would be to look locally for a good therapist to work with on this
Mhm.
who's got experience with adolescent substance use.
Okay. And you can find, if you're looking for a good therapist, you can go to psychologytoday.com and you can put in your zip code. You can ask for a range of 25 miles away to whatever, but you can also then put in there what your concerns are and it will filter down for you. So it's something to keep in mind if you're looking for a therapist. It says, I've heard good things about parent coaching available through Partnership for Addiction. An excellent presentation and thank you. So somebody's just making a comment. What are some of the best practices you can share when trying to educate and prevent teen use? However, their caregivers and parents use, so it is very normalized for them.
Oh, so that's really tough, right? Because they're looking up to those caregivers in some way, shape, or form. In many cases,
Yeah.
sometimes it's even unconscious because that's just kind of how we look at things. Um, so that is a really tough question to answer because really the dynamics that you're looking at here that are causing the issue, again, is this idea of either explicit or implicit permission. If you're looking at your parents who are doing this behavior, who are vaping, who are smoking, who are using substances to cope, and then what's the kid supposed to take away from that, right?
Mhm.
Other than that, okay, well, this is what they're doing, how should I not? I would say, if you have the ability to potentially work with the parents, that might be huge. Actually, at the most recent American Psychological Association conference, there was a really interesting presentation on someone basically saying how we have an ethical mandate to offer psychological services to parents at pediatricians' offices, because in many cases,
Wow.
the parents are the cause of a lot of these issues. If there's very poor practices going on, or if someone has an anxiety or depressive issue that they're not dealing with, not always, of course, but there's a lot that goes on inside the house, and there's only so
Mhm.
much that we can impact it unless we're given access. So I guess that would be my first question: is there any work that can be done with the parents around that for the good of the child? After that, I'm hesitant to say anymore, just because it's really not necessarily our place to come in and tell parents how to raise their child, or to tell children not to do what their parents are doing. I don't necessarily. I'd have to think a lot about that before stepping over that line. But I'd say,
Okay.
are there any parent-facing interventions that we can do?
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another thank you. Great presentation and very useful. What study says 1/3 is vaping in high school?
So I don't have the name off the top of my head. Again, if you pop over to my blog, it's it's like titled something about how we just had conflicting reports on vaping. What are we supposed to make of this? I linked to both CDC reports at the very top of that blog post. So you can just head over there, click on that, and it'll take you to it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does Dr. Weiner do presentations for staff or students, or both?
I've done both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know right now nobody's doing presentations in schools. So are you providing webinars for schools at this time? Is that an option?
Absolutely. I haven't done a virtual assembly yet. Like I don't know if that's something that someone would want to do. But certainly, yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to meet with faculty. I think a lot of people are making the jump to having meetings and seminars and conferences this way. So.
Okay. All right. Great. Um, Thank you so much. We got a nice compliment, a great webinar. So much terrific information. Operation Parent is fast becoming my favorite place to be for prevention. That's wonderful. Thank you. How can we get Dr. Weiner's presentation on marijuana?
Do we have
have it.
That would be my question. I don't. I'm trying to think if there's a recording somewhere online about it.
We actually have the recording up on our website. So if you go to our website at operationparent.org, you want to go over to resources, and then the very top of resources is free. resources. And that is where we have our webinar recordings. And in there is the list. It's quite a long list anymore with all the webinars, but one of them is Dr. Weiner's marijuana presentation. And I'm sure we're going to have you back in the future to do a new update on this, and in particular, continue this conversation of vaping marijuana and the edibles and all the different forms of it that have become so popular, and the legalization and how that's impacting. So, but yes, you can get that.
And if I could do one quick vaping there, I didn't do much of that overlap today. The one thing that I want to mention for folks who are wondering about vaping marijuana, just to be aware of, is that part of the issue with it is that kids are generally not vaping the flower, which is already 7 times about as strong as it was at Woodstock. Like the average recreational flower in buds right now are 21% THC. And the average flower at Woodstock was about 3% THC, but they're doing concentrates. So things like hash, or rather butter, shatter, wax, things like this, they can go up to over 90% pure. And so when we're looking at some of the negative implications of THC use, most of them, things like cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, psychotic breaks, all the really nasty stuff, come from, generally speaking, these concentrates, which are being sold in most legal markets as well as illegal ones. There's nowhere that I'm aware of that has put a THC cap on it. And because they're put in vape devices, they're far and away, that's what dabbing is what kids are doing with those THC vape pens right now. So just something to be very aware of. It sounds like the webinar was recorded. There's also, I can get a link out as well. I did so you'll see some repeated content from today, but I did one that involves a little bit more marijuana about a week or two ago, maybe a half an hour's with slightly more updated information. So I can send that out as well.
That'd be great. If a teen have not given any reasons that they are vaping, but parents just want to make sure that they don't miss anything, how can a parent rationalize that they should give their teen a nicotine drug test to their children?
So if they're not sure, but they want to make sure that they haven't missed anything?
Right.
Okay. Well, so here would be, so there's actually, I heard this from, a pediatrician I did a radio show from about a month, or no, more than that now. Gosh, time flies when you're in a pandemic. Maybe more like 4 months ago now. But so he was basically just saying, make it a matter of course. It's just kind of like as your kids go, particularly if they're still on the younger side of the teenage years, kind of like now, when anybody gets an opioid in a pain clinic, they're getting drug tested. And it's not, it's not like a statement of character. It's just it's a risk. A risk of having opioids is that things might get out of hand. And so we put the structure in place essentially to catch you if you were to fall. And that's the way this works. And so the same sort of thing is what's this one pediatrician recommended, and a friend of mine from undergrad college on Facebook. Really nice guy, has 7 kids. His first one just turned 13, and he said we had the talk about a lot of things that he needs to be aware of, and that we're just going to start drug testing once a month. And it's not because we don't trust you; it's just because that's in this family. That's what we do with teenagers. As we're doing it so that you've got a way out, and so that you've got this kind of underneath to make sure that you've got this supporting you. And that's just the way that it goes. It's not a lack of trust. It's just what we do in this family. And so that's part of how he was handling it. I think you kind of have to maybe adjust it for each situation. But if you can approach it not from a I don't trust you standpoint, but more from a this will actually help you and stuff happens standpoint. If there's a way to work that in your relationship, then you can do it. Certainly, it's a lot easier to do if you do it like my friend did from college, where it's just you're the first one. You're 13. We're starting to do this now. All the rest of them are going to do it too. Or if you know that they're having a problem, then it's a little bit easier to bring it up. But
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Why wearing long sleeves is a red flag that my kid may be vaping?
So it's not, that one's actually not about vaping. I know I was trying to get through my content really quickly because I knew we had a lot of questions probably to do at the end. The sleeves are not for vaping, but by and large. Sleeves potentially, if it's in long weather, you might be able to blow your exhalation in there, and then the vapor dissipates before it comes out. But there's more of a warning sign if they're trying to cover up needle marks, track marks, if they're injecting something.
Okay. It says if it's known to be dangerous, vaping, Why can't the government stop the production and selling of these products, and are to the tobacco companies being held accountable?
Really good question. So there are some good articles written on this. On like if you type in why was the FDA's hands tied for the vaping epidemic, you can learn some of the political underpinnings that went on here. They've actually had the ability to crack down on this since 2016. And even then, that was way too late, given that they did it for cigarettes in 2009. The quick answer to this is what we detailed in the presentation, that the industry has a lot of money. They are now very persuasive. Like any industry lobby that's working at this 24/7, they are working at this 24/7, and their voices are very, very loud. And they can create these narratives about harm reduction, about how it's not a big deal, about how we don't need a vape ban, we need something else, even though then nothing happens. They can do those sorts of things. So there's been some really good articles. If you're having trouble finding one, message me and I'll link you to them. But it just has honestly a lot to do with politics and money.
Okay, usually it does, right? So if you see puff bars in a local retailer, what would you do?
I mean, I don't know if it's illegal to say. I think that's very jurisdictionally related, you know, and what the
Okay.
laws are in that area and what they can sell. Puff Bar themselves is no longer operating. You can't buy one from their website, but if someone's already like bought a stock and is selling them at their gas station or vape shop, I mean, I don't know if there's any recourse about that, but they won't be able to get any more.
Okay. American Lung Association has just relaunched their NOT, Not Youth Secession program to address vaping. So there you go. It's another place to look. Question was, has he heard good things about parent coaching from Partnership of Addiction for Addiction? Have you heard anything, feedback
No,
from?
you know, honestly, that's the first I've heard of it. I'm gonna have to check. I think that's the second comment that's mentioned that. I'm gonna have to look at.
Okay. Somebody's asking for more information on brain development. Is that something that maybe in future to go into a little bit more about brain development?
Super interesting question. So yes, there's a lot of information on tobacco and brain development, and in terms of priming the brain to have like stronger dopaminergic reactions if someone uses other substances of misuse, and just a lot of things related to that. I think that as scientists, we're less likely to want to generalize even from tobacco to vaping, even if nicotine is kind of like a common agent, just because there are some differences. And I have not seen much on vaping and brain development yet, but that's something, again, if you need any articles or any help with that, reach out to me. I'm on faculty at the University of Illinois, and so I can pull a lot of journal articles if you are having trouble accessing them. I'd be happy to look into it. A great database if you're ever looking for medical information is PubMed. Just Google PubMed. I forget the exact URL for it, but that's basically the medical journal database that you use to find most medical journals. And you can see the abstracts there for free. You can't get the whole article, but that's where if the article isn't available for free and you'd like it, just email me and I'll try to get it to you.
Okay. Why do you think the UK and US have such different reactions to vaping? Even through the peak of the EVALI cases in the US, Public Health England was still promoting the use of electronic vaping devices to be used for those who want to quit smoking. Interesting.
That's very interesting. So I won't say that I have anywhere near a sophisticated knowledge on European drug policy in any way. What I will say, though, is that sort of behavior is very consistent, I think, across just addiction for profit enterprises. So just to give you an example, in Illinois, they voted to commercialize marijuana on January 1st starting. And so as Valley was starting up, and as you know, the Surgeon General was saying no one should be vaping THC for any reason, municipalities in Illinois were voting to open THC shops that sold that exact thing. So, I mean, I think that, and I like to juxtapose that sometimes with lettuce, where it's like, if there's like a farm in California where like the romaine has salmonella, like it's gone. You can't buy it anywhere. Like there's no salad mix anymore. And that's just from a couple of people getting sick. And in this case, there was like a mystery lung illness with people dying, and we're still like opening up new THC storefronts. So I just think that I think there's a double standard around addiction, and I think where money's concerned, that's to me it's actually pretty consistent. But again, just hearing that one anecdote, I don't know nearly as much about European drug policy.
Okay. Let's see here. I think we're getting down. Which chemical in e-cigarettes can cause DNA damage and mutagenesis?
Good question. I do not know that off the top of my head. My recommendation for you is to download the full report from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. You can then go to the section that conclusion is based on and just read that part, and that will have all the justifying information in there.
Okay, thank you. There are local prevention coalitions that offer evidence-based parenting workshops. It's just more of a statement. Yes, there are. Do you charge for your services, Dr. Weiner? I don't know in what.
I do. Okay, it depends what I'm doing, but yes, I do.
Okay.
I do charge. I do have a house and children of my own.
Says, do you have recommendations on the messaging or framing of the issue for elected officials to pass local regulations that limit vape sales and marketing?
Well, I think this is going to echo a lot of what we talked about today, which is that are there shared values that we can invoke? Are there ways that we can create? So when it comes to politics, and this is probably a much longer discussion than the roughly 45 seconds I think I have, although I'm happy to stay a little bit longer. It really comes down to you need to simplify issues. I heard once, and this really stuck with me, that like if it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, it's unlikely to gain traction politically. It's got to be simple. It's got to hit people emotionally. It's got to connect. And so you want to set up a juxtaposition between, like, say, health and money. And again, that's largely what it is. Or like who is being prioritized with this policy? Or this is what you got to make it simple, because if you're getting into an explanation, you lose people in many cases. So it's a really tough balance to both have integrity and to be thorough and to be accurate, but also to be politically viable. So that's a longer conversation, I think.
All right, and it says here, let's see, somebody was asking for your contact information, so I'm going to just flip through a few slides here and get that to come up again so that you have that.
Yep, so website's weinerphd.com. I'm at Aaron@weinerphd.com, and you can reach out to me on social media as well.
Okay. Michelle, do you have any questions as we wrap it up? We've hit all the questions. So wait a minute, somebody just asked last minute, what is the name of the article you mentioned in Reuters?
Reuters.
Sorry.
So try typing in Reuters Juul vaping investigative, like investigative journal, investigative report Reuters Juul. If it doesn't come up, email me. I'll get it.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Michelle, you have anything?
Yeah, I'll just give Dr. Weiner some props on social media. Particularly his LinkedIn account is where I do a lot of my reading on vaping. So that'd be a great place to connect and also just keep up with everything that's coming out and hitting the pike in terms of vaping. And then just a public service announcement for Operation Parents. If you could help your colleagues and friends know that just if they are not able to join us live, they can register and watch and listen at their convenience. So that's one piece of our messaging that we continue to try and get out to folks. Obviously, a very large number of you are still with us here today and listening to these questions, which we are grateful for. And thank you so much for your extended time with us today and all the ground that you covered, Dr. Weiner and Mary Beth, in these questions. It's been a great afternoon of learning. And I think we got to everything.
I believe we did. If there's a few that come in after the fact, I will send them to you tomorrow. If you wouldn't mind just writing a quick answer and shooting that off to them. But otherwise,
yeah, and Mary Beth, I think you did say this, but I just want to make sure. One of the comments that we got was to make sure and check with your local drug-free coalitions and health departments. I know you said that, but it'd be worth making an extra note on your notebooks to see what your local health department is doing in terms of cessation training, because I know our health department here locally is doing amazing work. So check out local sources if you can.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, Dr. Weiner, any last minute things you would like to add? I think we've had you on for an hour and a half, so I'm thrilled to death because you always do such a great job. But
Thank you. No, I would just say thank you again, everyone, for your time and for staying through the questions. I know that we all have so much going on right now, and so I appreciate it. Hopefully you're able to take something from this that you can use with your family, with your community. And again, please reach out if I can help you in any way.
All right. Okay, well, with that, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and shut down the webinar. Please keep in mind, right when I shut this down, you will receive the survey. If you can just take a minute to answer it, it just helps us get feedback and help us to continue the creation of future presentations. Also, tomorrow, please, 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 you will receive a follow-up email. It will come to you tomorrow around 4 o'clock with the link for the recording. And for those attending live, it will have a certificate of attendance. And for anybody else, as long as you're registered, as Michelle stated, you always get a follow-up email with the recording. So please don't ever cancel your registration because you can't attend live. That is the biggest thing. We get a lot of that right at the very beginning. People will start messaging, I can't make it, and they cancel the registration. Don't ever do that. That way you automatically get the recording tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and shut down. Thank you, Dr. Weiner. Thank you, Michelle. And we're gone for today. See you next time. Bye-bye.
See ya. Take care, everybody.